Hello chess fans, today we're going to be continuing our series on the Nimzo-Indian defense, and the variation that we will discuss today is called the Rubinstein variation. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. The opening moves are the same, so d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight to c3, and bishop to b4. This is the beginning of the Nimzo-Indian defense. And here, white plays this move pawn to e3. And this is the beginning of the Rubinstein variation. Okay, so there are a couple of details that we have to keep in mind when we play Nimzo-Indian. One is that everything revolves around the e4 square. So the idea of bishop b4 is to develop a piece and also control e4 simultaneously. That's why, for example, we don't develop the bishop to e7 because that allows e4. So we develop it to b4, and white plays this e3, and white wants to slowly build up for e4 by supporting it with bishop d3 or knight e2, knight g3 in some lines, and we will look at all of those. Okay, so after e3, now which variation do we choose? Because in this position we can play multiple moves. We can castle, we can play d5, we can play c5, we can play b6. So these are all valid moves that masters have played, and these are all valid continuations. However, in my opinion, there is generally a very principled way to play in this position, and the most popular move here is castle, and I think this is the best move. The reason why I think this is the best move is because we're staying very flexible with our pawns. We don't know yet if we want to push for d5 or c5 or b6. There are some lines where we want to play b6, put the bishop on b7 and play knight to e4, for example, and not even push our d or c pawns. There are some lines where we want to push c5, allow d5 for white and get kind of like a Benoni structure with the d6 and e5. There are some lines where we want to play like Queen's Gambit declined. But the thing is, when you play Nimzo-Indian, you have options and you can go into other opening structures. However, most of the time, you're most likely going to have improved versions of those structures. For example, if you go for like c5 lines, let's say c5, and d5 is not a good move, just to be very clear here, but I just want to highlight the idea here of what I'm talking about. If you go bishop takes c3, b takes c3, d6, let's say e4 or something, no, not e4, e4 hangs a pawn, let's say bishop d3 preparing e4. Here we are playing a Benoni structure. As you can see, there are d and c pawns, with pawns on d6 and c5 for black. There are pawns on d5 and c4 for white. However, we have traded off the bad bishop, and this dark square bishop in this structure would be bad because it would be blocked in by all of these pawns. We can get it out to g7 in Benoni positions, but that takes time, of course. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because with Nimzo-Indian, you are so flexible that you can go into many different structures and many different openings, but you can get like an improved versions of those openings, and you need to be aware of that when you play Nimzo-Indian. And I think that castling here keeps the position very flexible. You're not committing anything. So you castle in this position, and here already there are multiple continuations for white. Now let's discuss bishop d3. This is the most played continuation. There is also knight e2, and this is something that we will also discuss. So after bishop to d3, what we want to do is we want to play d5. The reason why we don't want to play b6, for example, is because white wants to play e4. Remember, everything revolves around the e4 square. So we want to disallow this by playing pawn to d5. So we go into this structure now. And here, white can play knight to f6. We take on c4 because this bishop has already moved. So we are forcing it to make another move. And after that, we play pawn to c5, a3. We can capture on a3, b takes c3, and here in this position we can go queen to c7. This is generally the correct setup that you should go for with queen c7. White cannot simply just castle, obviously, because this is hanging right here. There are tactical continuations. Even bishop to d3 doesn't quite work, because let's say this c takes, so cd5, cd5, cd4, cd4. After queen to c3, we are forking these two things, and if white plays a move like bishop d2, for example, defending the rook, then can take the bishop. So bishop has to retreat back to e2. So it does, it retreats back to e2, b6, castles, bishop to b7, standard development here, nothing crazy. Knight d7, white plays c4, rook d8, rook c8, and here we play like this. Here there are many ideas, like knight g4 is an idea, for example, that is probably the best move here, which threatens bishop takes f3, queen takes h2. So you have to play g3, and then we play like this. This is a very dangerous position for white. It is equal, but I think black has better chances in this position. You can experiment with all sorts of different continuations, but generally in these positions, this is the setup that you want. So just to recap, with this development that white did with bishop to d3, we have to play d5 because we're stopping e4. We take, we play pawn to c5, so this d5, c5, we're opening up the position, and then we take and develop queen to c7, b6, bishop b7, and we have a very nice position. Okay, so now going back, white does not have to play knight to f3. So what white can do in this position is actually play knight to e2. So white does, and here we take anyways. Why? Because this bishop already moved once, and after dc4 we can make it move again, and also we don't want to allow our opponent to take us, and in some lines we have to recapture with the e-pawn. For example, what I'm talking about is that we have an option here. We have two decent options. One of the options is to play b6 instead of taking. However, if we play b6 in a lot of lines, what white can do is white can take on d5. We really should not take with the knight, because then the pawn goes to e4. So we need to take the d5 pawn with our pawn and keep controlling the e4 square. This relinquishes the control over e4. And here the problem is after moves like castles, let's say bishop to b7, what white can do is white can play a3, bishop to d6, b4, stopping c5, and we play a6, disallowing the knight to jump to b5, disallowing the pawn to go to b5 and clamp down on our pawns. These sorts of positions, they're always going to end up with an isolated pawn or the hanging pawns, and it is something that I would recommend avoiding. So that is why I don't want you guys to play b6 and give that option to white, because if you take on c4 right away, now there is no more option for white to actually go into those structures, which might be more beneficial for them. Even though the position is equal, white has more winning chances, in my opinion. However, if you want to practice those openings and get really good at them, you can definitely do that. So here we do the same thing. We play c5, white plays a3, takes, pawn takes, we go queen to c7, bishop to d3. So here the knight is controlling the c3 square, so that tactic that I showed you earlier does not work anymore. Knight c6, castles, rook to d8. So white plays this move, pawn to f4, a6, knight to g3, and we start expanding on the queen side. I think this is probably one of the more dangerous variations that white can employ. After f5, we go e5 here, and I can go a bit more in depth. However, I don't feel the need to, because I think that we have covered enough in terms of the opening specifically. The middle game is something that you should study on your own. And the ideas here are very same. You want to continue developing. You want to play a6, b5, develop the bishop to b7, and pressure the center, pressure the diagonal here, just like this, and continue playing the game. I think this is probably one of the most dangerous variations, by the way. In my opinion, this bishop d3, knight e2, it's quite strong for white. So here, what white can do after castles is, instead of bishop d3, white can also play knight e2 immediately. Now, there's a specific idea here, and that idea is that after pawn to a3, we capture on c3, white wants to recapture with the knight. However, we don't want to allow that. So let's say in this position we play a move like d5, right? After a3, if we capture and white captures, we're not damaging the structure, and we have not really achieved anything by making this capture. The development is still equalish. Maybe black has slightly better development because, you know, white made some moves that waste a bit of time. However, white has the two bishops here, and eventually these two bishops are going to come alive. You know, what white will do is eventually put the bishop on b2 and play on these diagonals. This is dangerous, and I would not recommend going into this. So that's why in this position, I would not recommend playing the move d5. What I would recommend is instead you play this move rook to e8. Now, rook e8 has a very specific idea in mind. And the idea is that after a3, you want to retreat the bishop. You no longer want to take. And also, there's a benefit to not taking here, and that benefit is that white has to waste more time moving this knight away so he can continue developing, right? Because this knight is very awkwardly placed on e2, so it has to go to g3 and a lot of lines, actually right away. This is the main move, knight g3. And here we continue the same way. We go d5, bishop to e2, we capture, we wait for the bishop to develop, and then we take on c4, so it wastes a move. c5, cd, pawn takes d5, so e takes d5, knight to c6, bishop to e3, and here, this is where we justify our idea of rook e8. We play rook to e7 here, super cool idea. And after a move like rook to c1, let's say, we go rook to d7. So we maneuver the rook over to d7, and we pressure this file, this d file. And there's tremendous pressure here, and black has already equalized and might actually even be better here. So this is a very strong position for the black pieces. As for development, you want to play a6, you want to play b5 as well, put the bishop on b7. You do want to be careful, because if you play b5, this knight is unprotected for a move, so you have to calculate all the tactical sequences there and be very careful. However, if you manage to protect this knight, then you go a6, b5, put the bishop on b7. Your position is very strong. So that is the Rubinstein variation of the Nimzo-Indian defense. Just a recap here, after bishop to b4, e3, what white can do is play in three different ways. White can play bishop d3, knight f3, white can go knight e2 immediately, or white can play bishop d3, knight e2. These are all certain ways of playing. These are all valid ways of playing. However, you need to keep in mind that everything in Nimzo-Indian revolves around the e4 square. So with that in mind, I think this is it for this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great day.